Good morning, everyone. We'll start in a few minutes. Perhaps what we can do is treat this as more of an intimate seminar than it is a formal and stiff conference. So may I please request those who are seated at the back, join us up front here. We promise to make it painless. Thank you. All right. Once again, good morning to everyone. At this juncture, I'd like to request everyone to stand up for the invocation as well as the Philippine National Anthem. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We'll start again in a bit.
sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin.
Bahayan natin alalahanin, panahon tayo'y inalipin.
Nangalan niya'y ating sambitin, paanong di tayo inapin. Bayan muling magtipon, awitan ng Panginoon. Sa piling sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin. Bayan walang sawang purihin, ang puon natin mahabagin. Bayan isayaw ang damdamin, kandilin niya'y ating awitin, awitin. Bayan muling magtipon, awitan ang Panginoon. Sa piling sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin. Sa piling sariwain, pagliligtas niya sa atin. Bayang magiliw, kailas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
All right, thank you everyone. So once again, good morning to those who are present in this hall, which we fondly call Justicia. First of all, my apologies for the current state of things here in the law school. We're undergoing refurbishment, and it has caused, a few headaches, as anyone who has experienced construction works at home may, know firsthand. But in any case, I'm looking forward to this morning and very, very happy to see everyone who's here. But a shout out also to the more than 100 people who are watching us online. The last count was, I think, 117 on Zoom, and a number on YouTube as well. But I'm very glad for those who are actually here in person. It's been quite a while since the law school has played host to people coming on site to gather and to discuss issues which are both pressing and interesting as far as legal studies are concerned. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to welcoming more in the next few hours, as well as welcoming you back hopefully for the next few days. Our promise would be, of course, interesting talks and interesting lectures, as well as lunch. All right. So without further ado, perhaps I can invite the Dean of the School of Law of Ateneo de Manila University, Dean Jose Maria Hofilenia, to give his welcome remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone. And again, as echoing what Dean Maita had said, I'm very happy to see all of you here. For those of for those of us, no, who have had to endure a couple of years, of course, of just talking to a screen, having actual live bodies listen to you and seeing reactions, live reactions, is really something that we most welcome. I'm sure that is something that's shared by all. So, especially to our guests who flew in for great distances to come here to join us, a special welcome to all of you and good morning. On behalf of the Ateneo de Manila University School of Law, and despite the less than ideal conditions due to essential renovation work on our building, for which I apologize, it is still with much delight and privilege that I welcome you all to the Ateneo Law School campus and to this conference. To say a brief word about where you are right now, the Justicia, which is what we call this room, is the simulated courtroom of the Ateneo Law School, where students engage in moot court competitions, mock trials, classes even, and simulated appellate practice as well. It simulates the formal atmosphere of a courtroom, though not all of our local courts look like this, with raised judges' benches, the bench, a witness stand, counsel's table, and therefore, as you can see around you also, there are portraits of past and present justices of the Supreme Court who are Ateneo Law School alumni. As you are aware, the present composition of the 15-person Supreme Court includes 6 of our alumni. We still lack 4 portraits, actually. So more than any classroom, seminar room, auditorium in this building, Justicia is the one that exudes most law, legal practice, and its prominence, prestige, and importance. What better venue then for a deep discussion into serious issues of law than the Justicia? With respect to our conference, as you are aware, the conference that we are holding over the next 4 days has been organized under an Erasmus-funded project entitled Capacity Building for Legal and Social Advancement in the Philippines, or CALESA. Through the CALESA project, a network of European and Philippine law schools, as well as the Philippine Judicial Academy of the Supreme Court, have come together, among other things, in order for us in the Philippines to further enhance and keep current our awareness and knowledge of global perspectives on a variety of areas of law and on legal education itself. One of the ways of which this broad objective is sought to be met are through opportunities for learning, such as the conference we are here for today, where we will get an excellent opportunity through our valued European guest speakers to gain insights on issues of human rights from an international perspective. But like the horse-drawn carriage that a CALESA is, which can proceed in one direction and reverse itself and go in a different direction, the learning that will be had at this conference will not only be one way, as we hope that from our esteemed reactors and speakers from the Philippines, we who are in attendance, as well as our European guests, will likewise expand their knowledge of the same issues from a Philippine perspective. There is, however, more to the CALESA project than organizing conferences. Despite each one's uniqueness, both obvious and subtle, the CALESA member institutions, realizing their common interests, talents, and aspirations, are likewise collectively delving into a collaborative and cooperative effort to reflect, re-examine, and explore ways to enhance our content and methods as educators in law, with a view to increasing our relevance in an increasingly modernizing world, region, and country. And not any less valuable, CALESA is also about friendships among kindred spirits from different lands. But today, we gather to talk about human rights. And for us at the Ateneo Law School, this gains particular relevance as human rights is an area of law that is very central to our mission as a school of law. Indeed, it is clear from the articulation of its vision and mission that the Ateneo Law School wishes to contribute to the legal community lawyers who are fully aware that the law should be but a tool or instrument for the attainment of greater and more fundamental values, that the rule of law must be upheld to attain order, justice, and preserve and protect rights, the most paramount of which is the entire slew and set of human rights. For far too long, the Philippines has felt like a laboratory for human rights, what with our regrettable first-hand experience with suppression of freedom of speech and expression, extrajudicial killings, disrespect for indigenous people's rights, weaponization of the law, to name a few. But while being in our own sphere leads us to parochially focus on human rights conditions and campaigns in the Philippines, witnessed with our own Philippine eyes, so to speak, this conference we are participating in today and for the next 3 days reminds us anew that human rights is universal. That the Philippine experience is but one out of a host of encounters around the world with challenges to human rights. And thus we look forward to listening and learning from all of our conference speakers and to incorporate what we gain from this week into our daily undertakings so as to be more aware of and become better protectors of human rights, to further serve our nations, and to become better human beings. So good morning to everyone, and welcome once again to all.
Thank you very much, Dean Hofilania. Our first speaker, I had actually met only this morning, but I had heard very good things about her already from colleagues in the Ateneo Human Rights Center. Sina Paulsen obtained her BA in International and Global Studies from Dickinson College in 1995 and her Master of Science or MSc in Human Rights from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has been working with the UN at least since 2005 and has been with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2013, first working as a human rights advisor in Papua New Guinea and as OHCHR representative in Seoul since 2015 before becoming OHCHR's senior human rights advisor based in Manila in 2020. So to speak on human rights issues and challenges in the Philippines from the UN perspective, I'd like to welcome Ms. Sina Paulsen of the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator.
Great. Thank you so much. And first of all, let me say how delighted I am to have the opportunity to speak here. I think it was already mentioned, but we had a long lockdown in the Philippines, and it's really nice to be able to be in person, while of course we are also happy for everyone who's joining online. And let me start by thanking Ateneo Law School, the Dean, and the CALESA project and international colleagues who are here today for this conference. And it's a really, I think, important opportunity. I've of course looked at the schedule over the coming days. I think the issues we're going to talk about are pertinent and important ones that in a way go beyond the field of law and into many other fields and really shows the integration of human rights as a interdisciplinary field of study. This conference is particularly important as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Sorry, you can't hear me. um, the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are the ones we'll be discussing over the coming days. We will look at what has been achieved at the global and national levels, but of course also to reflect on what's needed for the coming years, because the UDHR its implementation is very much still a work in progress. With that, today I've been asked to reflect on the most pressing human rights issues and challenges in the Philippines from the perspective of the United Nations and the international community. And I approached this with a, I think, heavy dose of humility, because I think when you try to identify the most pressing human rights issues, perhaps it depends on who you ask, right? What is the most pressing? Well, depending on who you are, that will vary over time. But nevertheless, I will start with the UN's perspective, some recent global thinking on and frameworks on this, and then turn to the Philippines after that. So first, I want to refer to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs as we call them. The agenda around which all human rights and actually all UN action is supposed to be focused and has been since 2015. Human rights are very central to this agenda. Another key tenet is leaving no one behind and reaching those most behind first and those at risk of being left behind. There are a broad set of development goals, and they include things like eliminating poverty, quality education, reduced hunger, peace, justice, and strong institutions, which all have commensurate rights. So the right to education, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to non-discrimination. So working towards reaching these SDGs at the national level, also at the international level, in a sense, is working for human rights if it's done in accordance with the human rights framework and legal obligations of countries. And vice versa, promoting human rights is central to accelerating countries' efforts to reaching these sustainable development goals. The second document I want to refer to and give as a framework for this whole conference in a way is the Secretary General's report, the highest aspiration, a call to action for human rights. This document, and perhaps it's been a bit overlooked, is a really important document that really frames UN action as it should be centered around human rights, perhaps human rights as the least explored pillar among the 3 pillars of the UN. It was published in February 2020, just as COVID was hitting the world, so it I think didn't get perhaps the room it deserved. But it outlines the vision for human rights, really, a global vision. According to this vision, implementation of international human rights regime is essential to addressing the root causes and causes and consequences of conflict. It says that human rights underpins all efforts towards sustainable development, similar to the SDG, and it sets out 7 domains that are listed there: rights at the core of development, rights in times of crisis, gender equality and equal rights for women, public participation and civic space, rights of future generations, especially climate justice, rights at the heart of collective action, and new frontiers in human rights. So if we look at the agenda over the next 3 days, all of these are actually areas that we will delve into more, and I think it's quite good to link the national challenges to these international trends that are going on as well. The third document is our common agenda. The common agenda, in this document, the UN Secretary General again makes a call for renewed solidarity between people and future generations. He calls for a new social contract anchored in human rights. He calls for better management of critical global commons and global public goods, which deliver equitable and sustainable rights for all. He calls for a more networked, inclusive, and effective multilateral system, including in areas like global financing, social safety networks, environment, and conflict prevention. And interestingly, with a global summit on these sort of overarching big issues planned for 2024. So again, 2024 is only 6 years off from when we are intended to reach the SDG goals, but nevertheless a renewed emphasis on human rights as accelerators. So in a global context, these are the 3 big frameworks we are looking at least from a practitioner's view on human rights. But at the same time, with a lot changing, lack of predictability, climate change, new conflicts popping up even in places where we thought perhaps they wouldn't, and a strong call at the same time for collective action. So now, with this in mind, let me turn to the Philippines. And again, a bit of a caveat. I've chosen sort of 5 big areas, but of course there are many others that can be equally, that are also important. Within the Philippines, the UN has a country framework. And this is a framework that all UN agencies work under. It outlines activities. It's agreed with the government of the Philippines. And it's actually also aligned with the Philippine Development Plan. So it should support the government in reaching its sustainable development goals, but also its national development goals. At the same time, we have a set of specific human rights documents from the international human rights mechanisms that we also work to implement. These include recommendations from special procedures mandates, from treaty bodies, from the Human Rights Council, and from the Universal Periodic Review, the 4 main human rights instruments, which we are in the happy position that the Philippines has reported to a number of these very recently. So we have a new set of recommendations on many treaties, and we've had a recent visit of a special rapporteur. We are looking forward to another one this year. This is very positive because we had actually a period where there was, a limited number of reporting coming out. So this energy, I think, is credit and is important. So I will draw on what has been said by these international human rights mechanisms, as well as, the work of the UN in the Philippines when I outline these 5 areas. If you go to the next one. The first area I will talk about is this twin challenge of poverty and inequality. Suitable perhaps because it's also the subject of the first Sustainable Development Goal, which calls for ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. The commensurate rights include adequate standard to living, education, to health, to decent wages, the right to work, and to non-discrimination. In its UPR, the Philippines supported various recommendations, and some of them are up there. At the same time, poverty is a significant problem, and it is a human rights problem. Not because of poverty in itself is a human rights problem, but because of the way the inequalities prevent a significant number of people in the Philippines from reaching their human potential and living in dignity, right, and fulfilling their rights, basically. The most vulnerable groups, women, rural populations, the urban poor, fisher folk, indigenous peoples, those working in the informal sector and others, persons with disabilities, experience disproportionate rates of poverty, outlining then issues like discrimination, marginalization, and lack of access to equal opportunities. According to the Philippines Statistics Authority, 23.7 million Filipinos lived below the poverty line in 2020. At the same time, combined wealth of the 50 richest individuals in the country amounted to $72 billion. The high concentration of wealth impedes high economic growth rates from translating to rights in the form of investments into strengthening social safety networks, public goods such as schools, the right to quality education, rural development, access to fair wages for all, and environmental protection. So this is the link between poverty and human rights as we see it, and certainly a big issue in the Philippines. Next one. The second broad issue, and again, these are broad issues, but rule of law and strong institutions. And when we say strong institutions, we mean strong institutions based on law, not on, military power or other type of might, right? This is an area where the Philippines has come under a high level of scrutiny by the international community, including the UN. In the end, it's about people being treated equally under the law, having access to protection, restitution when they are wronged, and being held accountable regardless of position, wealth, or status. Rule of law, as we know, creates predictability, improving also, financial investments, prevents abuse of power, contributes to leveling the playing field, and underpins the exercise actually of a full range of rights. Within this area, let me turn to a particular area of concern for the international community and hopefully also for people in the Philippines, the high number of killings in the context of anti-drug operations that happened in recent years. We don't have exact numbers. The UN has said that as of 2020, at least 8,663 persons were killed. But as you know, there are estimates that are 3 or 4 times that as well. Families of the victims, in addition to losing beloved relatives, also lost breadwinners and have faced and continue to face stigma and threats in conducting their lives. For example, leading to dropping out of education opportunities or being forced to work in the informal sector where they continued the cycle of poverty. Most of those hit were poor in the first place. There have been some recent efforts to investigate some cases, but it's very little, and it's far from the norm. It's almost the exception when cases are investigated and brought to court. While the Philippines has an A-rated and very excellent National Human Rights Commission, there is a deficit in independent oversight over these some of these institutions, like the police and others who have who use force and that results in human rights violations. There's a lack of forensic expertise to investigate. There are some legal frameworks, but they are not always implemented fully. Under the Human Rights Council resolution, which came out of really this war on drugs, but also pointed out a range of other violations, the UN continues to work with the government to address some areas through what we call a UN joint program on human rights, where a number of UN agencies focus on capacity building and technical cooperation on human rights. But let me also say that as a sovereign nation, capacity building and technical cooperation can lead to an environment where certain things are possible and where technical skills are available, but ultimately, of course, a sovereign nation and a government has responsibility to bring this to a close. Third, next area is that of climate change and the right to a clean environment. The UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of rights in the context of climate change has said that human-induced climate change is the largest and most pervasive threat to the natural environment and societies the world has ever experienced, and that the poorest countries are paying the heaviest price. Although the Philippines is not one of the poorest countries, it is actually one of the most impacted by climate change. There has been improvement globally as well as in Philippines in preparedness, in how to prevent, for example, deaths in the context of natural disaster in particular. However, poor and marginalized populations continue to be disproportionately impacted, with a severe impact on life, health, access to food, and also when populations are displaced, a range of other risks like vulnerabilities to sexual exploitation and discrimination. Indigenous peoples risk losing livelihoods and traditional ways of living and traditional lands as well. And environmental defenders have been subjected to human rights violations in the Philippines. Actually, one of the groups most impacted in the Philippines are exactly human rights defenders working on environmental rights. And not only by state actors, but also by non-state actors facing human rights abuses. There is actually innovative and strong legislation in some areas, including the Indigenous Peoples Act. But again, it's not always fully implemented and not always implemented in the spirit of the law, where there is things like genuine, free, prior and informed consent that can lead to any outcome. So I'm now on number 4. Next one, please. The next area is peace and human rights. Big issue in the Philippines. In his call to action, the UN Secretary General states that there is a well-documented correlation between a society's enjoyment of and commitment to human rights, including non-discrimination, and its resilience to crisis. Human rights violations are often both a cause and a consequence of conflict and of crisis, and that's also the case here in the Philippines. Of course, in the Bangsamoro region in BARM, we have now the implementation of a comprehensive agreement and the enactment of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. And this is a historic opportunity for the Philippines, really, to increase and sustain peace in that region. But it's also important that to facilitate a sustainable transition, to address the root causes and drivers of conflict. And this includes things like economic inequalities, marginalization, environmental destruction, vertical and horizontal conflicts, and other factors. So very strong interaction with the rights framework. Cultural rights is another area that needs to be promoted. And this also means the strong inclusion of indigenous peoples, women and youth in any process, peace process, transition process, and other processes that are part of the state building and peace process. The establishment of a transitional justice and reconciliation mechanism could constitute a very important step towards addressing the past and addressing root causes. And the strengthening of the Bangsamoro Human Rights Commission, increasing broad human rights awareness in the region and in the Philippines, actually, and ensuring that the new legislation, the regional legislation that's being adopted, conforms to human rights obligations are also critical, and are areas where the UN is trying to support the Philippines and the local administration, together with other development partners, of course. Finally, this brings me to the last area, number 5, and which is, I think, also much of the topic of today's theme, which is that of civic space, including freedom of expression, freedom of association and conscience, and a range of other rights, actually, also, but these are the ones that we usually associate. In one way, the Philippines has benefited from constitutionally and legal guarantees of civic space and freedom of the media, and actually these have been exercised, and this is what we often hear from the government when we talk about this civic space issue and civil and political rights. And that is true, and it's an opportunity that exists here in the Philippines. at the same time, it's also true that those who exercise these rights fully and are at risk of human rights violations and abuses, ranging from killings, as we know, of human rights defenders, to judicial harassment, to gendered attacks on women and LGBTQIA+ activists, to threats and intimidation and other violations. So while the government has some good legislation, there's also some legislation that's problematic, and that includes things like criminalization of libel, and of course the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, which, while there are statements that human rights are guaranteed, actually doesn't conform to human rights obligations in some areas, and also has had a chilling effect, and I think a real effect on civil society, especially those working in remote areas, and human rights defenders, but also humanitarian actors. We've seen doctors and others being targeted under different types of not only the Anti-Terrorism Act, but also other types of related legislation. I want to mention here, though, that I do think the recent investigations into the killing of journalist Percival Lapid, is an important step, and is a decisive action. And this has a potential to sending strong messages, but we need more action like this. We need this to happen in every case, right? Including in past cases that where we are still waiting for action to be taken. The adoption of legislation on human rights defenders, the Human Rights Defenders Bill, I think could be a very clear signal of state intentions in this area, and could give added protection to human rights defenders. So that's something the UN is advocating also, as well as different protection mechanisms. So these are the 5 areas, and like I said, you can come up to me and ask me later why I didn't include this, that or the other, because there's any number of areas, of course, one could include. But these are areas the UN is working on. These are areas we think that if they are addressed and resolved, there would be some kind of impact on the whole human rights climate. There are also areas, of course, where the Philippines is playing a leading and important role in the international forums. And I'm thinking here of, for example, the steps that have been taken to protect migrant workers, the abolition of the death penalty in the Philippines, which is important in the regional level, and there are some others as well. But there are some good, there are some areas for hope as well. Final one. Yeah. So finally, back to the SDGs, because this is where we focus our work. But in his call to action, the Secretary General states that his goal for the UN is to promote a human rights vision that is transformative, that provides solution that speaks directly to each and every human being. And he says, to that end, we must broaden the base of support for human rights by reaching out to critics and engaging in conversations that reach deeply into society. I think this is true, and it's no less true in the Philippines. We need to somehow find spaces like this one, but also other spaces where we can have meaningful and deep conversations about difficult topics, about controversial topics, without personalizing, without making it about villains and heroes, but really to bring together different thinking on how we can find solutions, because clearly the UN doesn't have all the solutions. Youth have some solutions, but we need to bring them in. We need to bring in government actors. We need to bring in actors from the security sector, because they have different views and they also have something to contribute to have these discussions. And I think that's one thing we have been trying to do with the UN Joint Program, but also more broadly with the UN. it's very much aligned with this idea of collective vision, cooperation, um, and collective action. And at the same time, this does not mean that we don't hold people accountable, of course. I mean, we discuss human rights, we open the discussions, but we also make sure that accountability is fundamental for moving the discussion forward. And there are many types of accountability, you know, here in the law school, so there's the legal criminal system, but of course there are also other processes that can be employed, and transitional justice processes or other forms of memorialization. With this, I started to, this whole intervention with referring to the 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration, and I will also end with that, exactly because it is an example of what collective global determination can achieve. With the implementation of the Universal Declaration, we have had a profound impact in many parts of the world, perhaps almost in all countries of the world. And so looking forward for what we need for the next 75 years, I think, is our main challenge. But with that, I look forward to our more in-depth discussions in the coming sessions, and thank you very much, and isang magandang araw sa lahat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina, for that concise but very thought-provoking presentation. And thank you also for the gracious open invitation to discuss other rights which may not have been included in the 5 challenges. So we will have the opportunity to ask Sina our questions perhaps during the open forum after the last speaker. Now, the next speaker, I'm very happy to introduce. He's a very good friend who also teaches at the Jesuit University an hour away from Loyola. The difference being that unlike us who are an hour away from Loyola Heights and Ateneo there, he actually teaches at the Justo University, which is roughly an hour away from Loyola in Spain, where St. Ignatius, of course, was from. So Felipe Gomez Isa holds a BA in Law and Economics and a PhD in International Law from the University of the Justo. He is currently Professor of International Law at the university, where he teaches at the Bilbao campus. He teaches BA courses on international law and human rights, both in Spanish and in English, and MA courses on international protection of human rights and women's rights. He is also Associate Dean for International Relations in the 2023 agenda. So everyone, Dr. Felipe Gomez Isa.
Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here today with all of you. And I like to express my deep gratitude to Ateneo Law School for this very kind invitation to be today speaking before this audience, but also because of the participation in this CALESA project that the Dean referred to. It's been a fantastic opportunity to come together and to discuss on a number of issues that law, economics, anthropology, the different disciplines, as our colleague from the UN was referring to, can offer to the different issues and to the different challenges that are ahead of us. Well, as our previous speaker has referred to, I'm going to focus on one specific area where both in the Philippines but also globally there is a challenge, and there is a challenge but also an opportunity. I'm going to refer to human rights defenders and to the current situation in which human rights defenders are, and I'm going to do it from a European perspective. I will refer to the relevant actions, to the relevant programs, and to the relevant policies and norms that the European Union has adopted to support and to enhance the work that human rights defenders are doing. First, please. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm going to start with some context in which I'm going to situate the question or the issue of human rights defenders. Because now we are witnessing a backlash against human rights and democracy promotion. This context started to emerge in the 2000s, and this new climate is brought about by the relative decline of Western power and the rise of emerging powers in different parts of the world. I'm referring to the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, but also other regional powers. And this shift brought about growing hostility to the human rights and democracy support policies sponsored by the European Union, by the US, and by other international donors, especially those policies and especially those programs that seek to empower civil society. Well, the root causes of this global phenomenon are complex, are multifaceted, and are also inextricably linked to structural changes in global politics and global economy. So this is the background where we can find some responses to this decline of the support to human rights and democracy promotion policies. Well, and there are two main driving factors. First of all, the loss of democratic momentum in the 2000s. After the post-Cold War decade in the 90s, the 1990s, in which democracy assistance was very positively perceived, in the 2000s the situation dramatically changed, and power holders in many countries began to view such assistance as, first, excessively intrusive, and second, politically threatening. So the situation started to change. This counter-reaction has much to do with the democracy rhetoric that accompanied the unilateral and illegal 2003 Iraq war that was led by the US and by a coalition of states basically from Europe. This intervention, this disastrous military intervention, deepened the declining credibility of the West. Therefore, the democracy promotion discourse became synonymous for Western imposed regime change. So that's why in many corners of the world, and particularly in the global south, skepticism started to be present vis-a-vis democracy and human rights promotion. Well, the second driver, the second reason, has to do with the fear on the part of many authoritarian regimes of the capacity of independent civil society to challenge them, to challenge power, and to advocate for political challenges and political developments, especially in light of the developments in communications technology. These developments became an ally for the defense of human rights and for the defense of democracy. The leading role, this is a very relevant example, a very relevant case, because the leading role of civil society in the so-called Arab Spring in 2011 is started, as you remember, in Tunisia, then in Egypt, then in Syria, in Yemen, in a number of countries. Well, this crisis reinforced this negative perception on those in power, the so-called demonstration effect, and they started to fear the capacity of civil society to transform politics and to transform economics. And this paved the way for more repression and more obstacle to the activities of civil society organizations and human rights defenders. Just to name but a few, the case of Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Israel, Hungary, Poland, they all are examples where more repression and more obstacles to the actions of civil society were in place. The synchronous space for civil society, and our colleague from the UN has already referred to it, has taken the form of more and more sophisticated restriction to the actions of civil society. New laws limiting the operation of local and international NGOs. Just some examples. I don't know if you have heard of the banning of the operations of Memorial, a Russian NGO working on memory and working on the making accountable for past injustices of the period of the Soviet Union. It's been closed down. Or the same has happened with Open Society in Hungary, and we could continue with more examples. Limitations to access foreign funding. This is another restriction. Expulsion of human rights defenders, acts of surveillance, arbitrary arrest and detention, stigmatization, criminalization, unfair trials, enforced disappearances, torture, killings, and so on and so forth. So this is the situation that human rights defenders face nowadays in the Philippines, but elsewhere. I'm not going to deepen because our colleague Alain back on will refer to it more in detail. And the second part of my lecture has to do with the response and the European Union actions on human rights defenders. Well, first of all, we have to reiterate once again the firm commitment of the EU on the protection and promotion of human rights, both internally, both domestically in the member states of the EU, but also externally in their relations with third states. I'm going to refer to one specific provision of the Treaty of the European Union, adopted in 2007, and it entered into force 2 years later in 2009. Well, in Article 2, we find this specific reference to the values of the European Union. I quote, "The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities." And these values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. So this is the commitment that the European Union has made to promote and to encourage respect for human dignity and human rights. Well, in this context, one of the core priorities of the European Union in its external human rights policy is precisely the support to human rights defenders as key agents of change. The EU is the main global contributor of financial support to the activities of human rights defenders. Please? Excuse me? Yeah. Well, these are the main policies and actions that the European Union has developed on human rights defenders. I'm only going to refer to some of them because I don't have the time to go into detail. But first of all, the adoption of a very relevant policy document, the EU Guidelines on Human Rights Defenders. They were adopted by the Council of the EU, the highest political body of the European Union. They were adopted in 2004 and were revised in 2008. Second, the political support and visibility. I'm going to refer to I'm sure that you have heard of this Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament. Every year, the European Parliament awards a prize to a very significant human rights defender in different parts of the world. Third, the financial assistance. There's a specific program and a specific funding scheme, the so-called European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. In terms of funds, is a very relevant funding mechanism. And last but not least, institutional developments that have taken place in the context of the European Union. I will refer to the focal points in EU delegations, to the human rights defenders, liaison officers, and the proposal of the creation of an EU special representative on human rights defenders. Please. First, the EU guidelines on human rights defenders. These guidelines, once again, were adopted by the Council, are a policy document aimed at guiding the actions of the relevant bodies of the EU when it comes to the support to and protection of human rights defenders. So these guidelines are addressed to all bodies of the European Union, to the Parliament, to the Commission, to the Council, to the Member States, to the EU delegations in different parts of the world. They all have to try to comply with these guidelines adopted by the Council of the EU. The purpose is to provide practical suggestions, practical recommendations for enhancing EU action in that regard, EU action in the area of human rights defenders. These guidelines are to be used in contacts with third countries at all levels, when there are contacts between the European Union and the Philippines, the European Union and the US, the European Union and Morocco. These guidelines are on the table, and these guidelines are to be brought and are to be mentioned in these bilateral fora. In human rights dialogues, this is all a very relevant mechanism that the European Union uses. Human rights dialogues with China, with Russia in the past, not now, with the Philippines, with African countries. In multilateral human rights fora such as the UN, in EU delegations, so in a number of specific fora. And the aim is mainstreaming the interest of the EU in supporting human rights defenders worldwide. So this is the basic aim, the basic purpose of these guidelines. And these guidelines follow the principles contained in the UN Declaration on the right and responsibility of individuals, groups and organs of society to promote and protect universally recognized human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is the so-called United Nations Human Rights Defenders Declaration that was adopted 25 years ago because our colleague from the UN has referred to the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But this year, we are also going to celebrate, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the adoption in December 10, 1998, of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And actually, I like to refer to a significant conference that will be organized by the University of Deusto, where I work, in cooperation with ARI. ARI is a network of human rights institutes. It's ARI's Association of Human Rights Institutes, a conference focused on the situation of human rights defenders worldwide, and the title of this conference is Human Rights Defenders Under Siege, and it will take place on September this year. I already sent information to the Ateneo Institute, to Ateneo Center for Human Rights, but if you are interested, I can send information to you about this conference, and that the call for papers is open, so you all can participate in this conference where we will discuss, but not only between academics, because the idea is to invite also human rights defenders to bridge the gap and to find and to discuss and to try to develop common solutions and to identify best practice to deal with the situation of human rights defenders. Because we are convinced, and this is the main rationale of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, that human rights defenders are an essential pillar of any democratic system. They're key for a democracy, for a vibrant and for a developing democracy. Please. Well, through the adoption of the guidelines, practical support for human rights defenders has been developed, and these are only some examples. First of all, different programs of capacity building and human rights education programs. For instance, I don't know if you've heard of the Venice School for Human Rights Defenders. This Venice School is organized every June in cooperation between the European Parliament and the Global Campus of Human Rights based in Venice in Italy. And actually the Ateneo Center for Human Rights is also a member of the Global Campus of Human Rights. It's a global network of academic institutions working for human rights. So every June, a number of human rights defenders and all the awardees of the Sakharov Prize, awarded by the European Parliament, they come together, they meet in Venice to discuss and to have a full week of conferences, meetings, moot courts on human rights issues, and specifically on the challenges that human rights defenders face worldwide. Well, the European Union also supports public awareness campaigns. It also assists in the establishment of network of human rights defenders at international level. It also tries to ensure that human rights defenders in third countries can access resources from abroad. And this is a key issue, because remember that I refer to these systematic policies on the part of some governments that try to curtail and that try to limit this access to foreign funding, including in the Philippines, and also support to human rights defenders at risk. So these are, again, some examples of the actions, of the measures, of the programs that the European Union is financing and is launching. Please. Second, political support and visibility, especially through the Sakharov Prize, and I've referred to it. Since 1988, the European Parliament Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought has been awarded to both individuals or organizations that have made an important contribution to the fight for human rights or democracy. It is named after the Soviet physicist and political dissident Andrei Sakharov. So that's why the term, the title of this prize is Sakharov Prize. Well, last year, in 2002, the Sakharov Prize was awarded to the brave people of Ukraine that are fighting the illegal military invasion by the Russian Federation. Please. The third measure is the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. This is a funding mechanism, also very interesting for some local NGOs and some local activists in the Philippines or in the Asian region that can access this funding. And that in this context, the European Union has funded so far more than 200 projects in support of human rights defenders. More than 200 millions of euros have been spent on support, political, but also practical support to the activities of human rights defenders since 2006, when this program was created. The main priority of this funding scheme is to support civil society in third countries as the best way to promote democracy. So this is the key priority of this funding mechanism, is the support to civil society and the support to human rights defenders. Some projects, only because the list is very long, some projects, for instance, the funding of the Global Campus of Human Rights. The Global Campus is based in Venice, in Italy, but it coordinates 7 regional masters in different regions of the world. There's an Asia-Pacific master in which Ateneo takes part, but there is a master in Africa, there is a master program in Europe, there is a master's program in Latin America, in Argentina. So this is developed through the Global Campus that receives support from this funding mechanism. Second, economic support to UN special procedures, particularly to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, or the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. So these mechanisms, they receive support from the European Union through this European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. There is also a very recent program to support Afghan scholars and the Afghan human rights defenders that had to leave Afghanistan. Many of them were in Pakistan or in Iran, but the situation was very threatening for them. So almost 50 Afghan refugees have been placed in different academic institutions in Europe. For instance, in Deusto, we've welcomed 5 families from Afghanistan that have to leave the country because of the threatening situation for them. And last but not least, the creation of a human rights defenders mechanism. It's a specific mechanism led by NGOs, and it's a consortium of 12 human rights NGOs under the leadership of frontline defenders. It offers several forms of support, from emergency support and material assistance to human rights defenders under threat, relocation in third countries where needed, capacity building, training, so a number of activities, please. And last but not least, institutional developments. First of all, and this is the key institutional development that has taken place in the EU context, is the creation of the so-called human rights focal points in EU delegations. So in every EU delegation in a third country, a human rights focal point needs to be created. And the main aim, the main goal of these focal points is to coordinate the efforts of EU delegations in the area of human rights and democracy promotion. They have and they play an important role in putting into practice the EU's policy towards human rights defenders, but especially the EU guidelines on human rights defenders. The different actions that can be taken by these focal points: first of all, they share information on the situation of human rights defenders in the country. They also maintain regular contacts with human rights defenders and their organizations on a country basis. They also provide, where appropriate, visible recognition to human rights defenders. They give publicity to their work. They visit some specific areas of some specific organizations. They invite them to conferences, to seminars, to bilateral meetings with the EU delegation and the country. So they offer different avenues. They also attend and observe trials on human rights defenders. That's another action that can be taken. Or they also appoint a specific human rights defenders liaison officers. So, and this is even more specific, more detailed, because these liaison officers, they deal specifically on human rights defenders. And that's why some scholars, but also some organizations, are making a proposal to create a specific body at very high political level, an EU special representative on human rights defenders. Because there's now an EU special representative for human rights, but the idea is to make it even more concrete, to create an EU special representative on specifically human rights defenders. And let me conclude, and let me especially have a look to the future. So conclusions and challenges ahead. Well, first of all, we are witnessing a backlash against those that try to promote human rights and democracy. This is a fact. This is an evidence. And the situation is increasingly complex and challenging for human rights defenders. Just a comment on a specific figure given by Global Witness. Global Witness is an NGO that basically monitors and documents attacks and threats on human rights defenders and environmental defenders. Well, only in 2020, 227 environmental defenders and human rights defenders were killed. Half of them were killed in Mexico, Colombia, and the Philippines. So these are the most dangerous countries for the activities of human rights defenders, environmental defenders. Against this background, the EU has tried to offer a response, to do something about it. And support to human rights defenders is one of the core priorities of the human rights policy of the European Union. Much has been done, but there is significant room for improvement. First of all, the so-called credibility gap. The EU must practice what it preaches if it wants to be considered as a credible global actor in the field of human rights and democracy promotion. There are legitimate criticisms on double standards and lack of coherence between internal and external policies, especially in the area of migration, where, as you know and as you can imagine, the situation and the actions of the European Union, again, are under a strong criticism. The second challenge is the need for a more focused support to those human rights defenders that are at a special risk. Women human rights defenders, so a gender approach and a gender perspective is much needed. LGTBI activists, they're also under a specific threat. Environmental defenders, and particularly indigenous rights defenders. 40% of the victims, 40% of those killed in 2020 were indigenous, although indigenous peoples only account for 5% of the global population, so they're overrepresented in those that are threatened, or those that are killed due to their activism on land rights. Digital defenders should also receive a specific assistance. Local organizations and local human rights defenders should be given more priorities, and not only those organizations and individuals working in the capitals or in the big urban areas. need of lighter administrative procedures and less bureaucratic funding schemes. All of us working on EU projects do know about, I mean, the heavy and about the the bureaucratic obstacles that are in place. So we need more lighter administrative procedures and less bureaucratic schemes. And finally, the need for greater visibility of the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights Activities and better information about funding opportunities. Salamat po, eskerrik asko, gracias.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Our next speaker was supposed to be Dean Melencio Santamaria, who is from Ateneo Law, has been a long-time professor of law review also in Ateneo Law, became Dean of the Far Eastern University's School of Law, and has since then also become somewhat of a personality as far as media is concerned. He appeared on TV. He's on radio. He writes for newspapers, etc. Unfortunately, Dean Mel has taken ill and is not going to be with us this morning. But he has had, prepared a paper and all, and so we have his equally brilliant wife, who also teaches in Ateneo Law, Professor Ampi Santamaria, who has just finished her stint, kept well under wraps for the longest time as the bar examiner for civil law for the national bar exams. So she will read his paper.
Thank you, Dean Maita, for that bombastic introduction. I will just read his speech, and I cannot promise that I'll be as animated as he is. I can imagine how he will read this, but I'll try. So, the title of the reaction paper is Media and Government Institutions. In the Philippines, I begin with the 1987 Constitution. It is the most important organic political document that provides us with the three great branches of government: the executive, legislature, and the judiciary on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Bill of Rights, which contains the freedom of the press and expression, which is the most relevant part for purposes of our discussion. Section 4 provides that no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. The press is surely within any discussion of the media. During the deliberations of the Constitution, the late Father Joaquin Bernas of the Society of Jesus, also a lawyer and one of our brilliant and most revered constitutionalists, former Dean Emeritus of the Ateneo School of Law, was asked, whose abuses was the Bill of Rights intended to repel? In no uncertain terms, he said, the government. This, in a nutshell, is a testament that the Constitution was built on lessons learned during the repressive martial law regime of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos from 1972 to 1986. During that time, free press was effectively curtailed, and what came out as a press were mere subservient propaganda that enabled the perpetuation of martial law for years. And so we have a very sound constitution, at least the way it was written. It seeks to safeguard the maintenance and the constructive tension between the press and the government. One of my favorite jurisprudential descriptions of speech in a democracy says that there must be a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, wide open, and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. This combative attribute, sans violence and irresponsibility, are vital. Also important is the declaration of the court that government officials are property of the public and that they should not be thin or onion-skinned. So let us go to the three great institutions of Philippine government and briefly look at the more dramatic actions each of them have undertaken in relation to media in this country. The Executive Department. We are not yet far off from the end of the last Duterte administration. During that time, the phrase extrajudicial killing, or EJK, became a byword in the Philippines. This involves the murder of those suspected of dealing with drugs committed by state agents. It was reported that this resulted in hundreds of killings. It was so serious a concern that now there is a case pending investigation in the International Criminal Court against certain Philippine government officials, including the former President Duterte. Rappler, one of the largest and most read internet news sites in the country, headed by Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, covered the drug war and these killings with incisive and graphic reporting, truly a no-holds-barred attitude. The executive responded by calling Ressa a fraud and banning Rappler's reporters from Malacanang, the seat of the presidency. More egregiously, the state flexed its prosecutorial powers to the hilt, targeting Rappler and Ressa with so many cases, from investigation in the Securities of Exchange Commission to criminal cases for tax evasion and libel. Ressa is said to have needed to post bail more than 10 times. From a larger perspective, it is said that 22 journalists were killed in the country since Duterte was elected in 2016. This is the same president that has openly declared that, I quote, "Just because you are a journalist, you are not exempted from assassination if you are a son of a bee." End of quote. Of course, it was not B. As to the newly elected President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., it is still early in his presidency. There are reports that he has been more receptive to journalists and at least has allegedly been more civil than his predecessor. However, superficial niceties aside, the reality is that the threats under the current administration may be more insidious than the last. This is a president, after all, who allegedly rose to power on the back of a deep and complex misinformation campaign run mostly through social media. One of his administration's first move was the accreditation of bloggers to Malacanang Press Corps. These have been described as hyper-partisan, non-journalists. Indeed, the great struggle with the current administration is how to thrive on fake news during the election period and may continue to thrive on the same. This and the continued discrediting of legitimate journalists and news sites, opting to nurture propagandists in the place of legitimate news media, seems to be the new modus operandi of the executive. How the law is now how is the law now to confront matters for which there may be no precedent remains to be seen. The challenge with the executive branch, despite the administration change, remains a formidable one. Going now to the legislature, it is no secret that probably the most significant matter in the question of the legislature's relationship with media is their opting to deny a franchise and effectively closing down ABS-CBN, one of, if not the largest media organizations in the country. Some of my colleagues would claim that they are the only ones who have real movie actors and actresses. While this was no doubt spurred on by President Duterte and his personal grudge against the network, Loud words and threats would have meant nothing without the acquiescence of legislature. And so Congress in this case became the sword of the government, taking up the cudgels for a temperamental executive. Admittedly, the grant of a franchise is purely discretionary on the part of the legislature. There are, so to speak, very little legal standards in the grant of a media franchise in the Philippines under the Constitution. Still, the franchise hearings themselves were a mockery, politicking, attempting to hide behind a thin veneer of legalism, questions of tax evasion, when the Bureau of Internal Revenue itself certified that ABS-CBN had no pending tax deficiencies, manufactured questions on the citizenship of one of the owners, who was, by the way, definitely a Filipino. It is interesting to note that this is the same Congress which was pushing for amendments to the Constitution to change the nationality requirements for various industries. And finally, and perhaps the most insulting of all, was the faux concern of the Congress had for alleged labor violations of ABS-CBN, none of them proven when the Congress itself was about to and did put thousands of workers out of work by virtue of the closure. And this is to not even start with the very real legal rights which underlie the actions of Congress. While it is true that the grant of the franchise is discretionary and that there are no legal standards on which to measure the correctness of the decision, save little constitutional mandates regarding the procedure and minimum requirements, this is a very limited and technical way of looking at it. The real question is whether the legislators involved, who are supposed to be representatives of their people, truly had the best interests of their constituents in mind when they cast their votes. And best interests of a people necessarily means respect for their rights and what would safeguard these rights. Section 4, Article 3 of the Constitution provides that no law shall be passed abridging the freedom of speech, of expression, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceable assembly. And the people and petition the government for redress of grievance. Section 7 mandates that the right of the people to information on matters of public concern shall be recognized. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. The right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Similarly, Section 19 of the ICCPR provides that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference, and everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. Did the members of the House of Representatives consider all these cardinal points in rejecting ABS-CBN's application? When a franchise fortifies what are supposed to be enduring democratic values, the balance must overwhelmingly tilt in favor of its grant, especially when the grounds for rejection are flimsy. That must apply not only to ABS-CBN, but to all legitimate media networks, because in the process, democracy is strengthened. The denial of ABS-CBN's franchise application resonates with all of us. Our job, security, our freedom of information, expression, and the press, our fundamental right to know and be happy. Through the closure, the legislature presented its more than willingness to be an instrument not of people's rights and media freedom, but of personal vendetta. It remains to be seen how it can redeem itself. Finally, we reach the last great branch of government, the judiciary, and here I would like to focus on the notion of sub judice. While normally contentious in other jurisdictions, the same is near automatic when it comes to the Philippine courts. Thus, I believe that a closer look is warranted regarding the familiarity and even comfort both courts and legal practitioners have with invoking the sub judice rule and controlling media in the exercise of their duties as a result. Undoubtedly, the sub judice rule is meant to prevent overwhelming public outcry to influence the goings on inside courts of law. It provides a quiet, or perhaps one should say silent, environment in which judges may settle matters with as little outside tension as possible. However, this is to the great disadvantage of the public, for which media coverage is not tension but information to which they have a right. Because a case is sub judice, courts more often than not, especially in criminal cases, would not want parties and their counsel to talk about the case. At times, people, like journalists and broadcasters, are also prohibited because of a blanket order emanating from the court. A cavalier imposition of a gag order just because a case is pending violates the more fundamental constitutional right of freedom of speech. Not all discussions of a case outside the court should be subjected to the sub judice rule. The familiarity with which our courts treat the sub judice rule is all the more important in administrations which see many controversies which eventually make their way to courts. In the past administration alone, we have the Marcos burial issue, the Chief Justice Sereno's impeachment and quo warranto case, Ombudsperson's Conchita Morales' refusal to obey an unlawful executive order, Rappler's tax and ownership cases, Maria Reza's own personal libel cases, extrajudicial killing, Senator De Lima's incarceration, and the imposition of martial law in Mindanao. The Supreme Court has previously set guidelines for media coverage of exceptional cases, such as the plunder trials of the former President Joseph Estrada and the Maguindanao massacre, which saw the killing of 34 journalists. This seems to hint that, at least in the past, the Supreme Court recognizes the exceptional role of media and information in relation to judicial proceedings. However, the problem lies when the judiciary treats media coverage and free flow of information as more of the exception rather than the rule. In times such as the current administration and the one immediately preceding it, where controversial and political cases seem to be the norm, how must we treat media coverage, and will adherence to sub judice, which has become part for our course for us, suffice? A number of young lawyers ask me, which is the ethical and moral side in all this? I say to them that the complexity may be more apparent than real. Distilling the essence of the issues, the right position may not really be difficult to determine. The standard will always be the Constitution, its spirit, and the aspirations of its provisions. This includes the policy of full public disclosure, the right and freedom to information, and most importantly, the freedom of expression and of the press. Also, non-commenting on judges belong to a bygone era. Supreme Court justices are public officials with no direct mandate from the people. And I mean this with no disrespect to the importance and legitimacy of their role in the government. They are not elected, and yet they have the most secure term with salaries funded by taxpayers' money. They are granted great power to determine important cases, ranging from individual private concerns to interests involving the whole nation and our democratic way of life. So much privilege is given to the magistrates, and yet no direct means are given to the people to immediately put them to task on decision which, at least perceivably, may be jarring to the common citizen. The notion of a cloistered judiciary beyond critical scrutiny belongs to a bygone era. Then U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Brewer said, and I quote, "It is a mistake to suppose that the Supreme Court is either honored or helped by being spoken of as beyond criticism. On the contrary, the life and character of its justices should be objects of constant watchfulness by all, and its judgments subject to the freest criticism. The time is past in the history of the world when any living man or body of man can be set on a pedestal and decorated with a halo. True, many criticisms may be, like their authors, devoid of good taste, but better all sorts of criticism than no criticism at all. The moving waters are full of life. Only in the still waters is stagnation and death. End of quote. And so it should be with the Philippine judiciary. To conclude, where now does this leave law practitioners, journalists, and the public? In the face of great odds, it seems that we have nowhere to look to safeguard media freedom in the Philippines. But this is not true. The Constitution remains, and it is the single strongest weapon the public has, at least speaking legalistically, against all forms of tyranny, including the suppression of media. But more than legal documents, we must turn to the people themselves. This country has a long and perhaps problematic history with being very litigious and boiling down issues into legal questions when they are in fact political, cultural, social, and economic. To think that just because laws and constitutions stand in the way of tyranny, that it will not prevail is the same thinking that left us with the ABS-CBN closure and the Raptor SEC controversies. All arguably legally passable decisions, all horrible decisions in any case. Therefore, and this may be quite ironic given that we are in a legal conference and I am a lawyer, I think one of the more important ways we can go about securing media freedom is to look past law and legal institutions. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort, not the first. We should look not to defeat media oppression solely or primarily in courtrooms, but in the streets, in the classrooms, in the halls of political debate, where discussion is brash, loud, sometimes unruly, but where power is undeniably seated. We must engage the political. Statutes and rules can only do so much, and we have seen that in the past. We continue to see it today. Any analysis of media freedom, and here I expose myself, that is purely legal falls undeniably short. It is therefore our next challenge to push beyond these laws and reach people, for only we, the people, the true sovereign, can save ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Santamaria. Both Professor Santamarias. At this point, may I invite you just to, perhaps stretch your legs a bit. We had provided or had allotted 15 minutes for a break at this point, but can I request that we shorten that to around 7 minutes? We can start at 10:45 so as to catch up on lost time. There's coffee there's coffee and water outside. You can actually bring the coffee in to this much cooler area. So please, everyone, I'll see you in a few minutes. right if we can perhaps invite those still outside to come in? We will start again. Our next speaker is well equipped, and that is an understatement, to talk about the next topic. Let me just introduce her briefly. So, Attorney Bagao is an alternative lawyer and a human rights advocate who also just happens to be a former member of the House of Representatives and the immediate past governor of Dinagat Islands. So she's better known as Kaka, and she was the lead counsel of the Sumilaw farmers. And for those who perhaps are too young, we have quite a number of young folks in the audience. For those who are too young to remember the Sumilaw issue, these are the farmers who walked about 1,700 kilometers between Sumilaw in Mindanao and Manila to precisely highlight the importance and the significance of the case. She led civil society organizations in the passage of the Carper Law, or the Law on Agrarian Reform, and is a valued community organizer and lawyer for the poor and marginalized. So she has worked with Balaod Mindanao, Saligan, and of course the alternative law groups. And in those circles, let me just tell you, she's practically a rock star. So she served 3 terms in the House of Representatives as Congresswoman of Akbayan Party List in the 15th Congress, and as District Representative of the Lone District of Dinagat Islands in the 16th and 17th Congresses. She is also the principal author of progressive landmark laws, such as the Reproductive Health Law, the Philippine HIV and AIDS Policy Act as well. And as governor, she really, tried hard to build resilient and self-reliant as well as healthy communities in Dinagat Islands. So I hope she gets another chance to serve. But in the meantime, she has also promised, and I'm going to publicly put her on the spot, she has also promised to teach in Ateneo Law come next academic year. So everyone, Kaka Bagao.
Ateneo School of Law Dean Jose Maria Filenya, Associate Dean Maita John Gonzaga. It's not true. Sorry, Dean. I'm thinking about it so hard. Fellow human rights defenders from the Philippines and Europe, and honored guests, friends, good morning to all of you. Today I just came from Dinagat Islands, by the way. I arrived yesterday and I'm leaving tomorrow. So I came here just for this. Today I was given the task by Dean to join the opening of the week-long conference of CALESA. And with that, I will do my very best, especially since I am speaking in front of officials and professors of the Ateneo School of Law, where I earned my law degree. Kaya sana, Ma'am Ampi, ay mataas pa ang makuha kong grade sa recitation ngayong araw. No cause is more worthy than the cause of human rights. And this is probably our common mantra in our community of human rights defenders, which was first said by Jose K. Pepe Jokno, Senator of the Philippines, Secretary of Justice, founding chair of the Commission on Human Rights, and founder of the Free Legal Assistance Group, or the FLAG. But for us, in spite of the different fields of practice, in spite of where we are based, the cause of human rights binds us together as one community across the globe. And we all know the challenges of defending the human rights of the marginalized. We are forever engaged in handling a lot of cases involving urban poor fisher folks for disenfranchisement, marginalization, etc. However, we now find ourselves in dark times where we also need to defend ourselves. The defenders also now need to be defended. And human rights defenders in the Philippines face threats, intimidation, and violence from various actors, including state and non-state actors. These include harassment, surveillance, physical attacks, and even extrajudicial killings. Human rights defenders who work on issues such as land rights, environmental protection, indigenous peoples' rights, and social justice are particularly vulnerable. And we also face criminalization and legal harassment through the misuse of laws and legal processes. Human rights defenders are falsely accused of trumped-up charges such as sedition, illegal assembly, or terrorism in an attempt to silence and intimidate. Impunity and lack of accountability for human rights violations remain a significant challenge in the Philippines. Human rights defenders who speak out against abuses, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture, often face threats and violence with little or no consequences for the perpetrators. This culture of impunity undermines the safety and security of human rights defenders and hinders our ability to carry out our work effectively. No cause is more worthy than the cause of human rights. Yes, of course. However, in these times, no profession or vocation is more dangerous than the cause of human rights defenders. This is our unfortunate reality right now. And hopefully, through this week-long conference, we find answers and solutions to change the situation. And from the report, based on findings of the Civicus Monitor, just to give you some data at Global Civil Society Alliance that has worked for around 2 decades to strengthen citizen action and civil society across the globe, especially where participatory democracy and citizens' freedom of association are threatened. The Philippines is classified among countries in the Asia-Pacific that have a repressed civic space. Civicus further states that among the most common violations were the passage and implementation of restrictive and vague laws to criminalize activists and those who criticize government who suffer from arbitrary detention, verbal discrediting, red tagging, which is very common now, even in islands like Dinagat Islands, or being labeled as terrorists or subversives, intimidation of their families, digital attacks, and many others. And because of this culture against human rights defenders that is perpetuated by the government, many are arrested on trumped-up charges, and these include those working in grassroots communities and even publicly known personalities like former Commission on Human Rights Chairperson and Senator Laila de Lima, who continues to be under detention due to false accusations by the past administration only because she chose to speak up against human rights violations. The government also continues to blatantly diminish human rights and harass its defenders through the formation and continued operation of bodies such as the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-ELCA, that uses disinformation and red tagging as its primary weapon. And because of this information, the general public and government enforcers on the ground are indoctrinated with false values that lead to ignorance. In my experience as the governor of Dinagat Islands, I had to intervene when police at the municipal level began to profile and intimidate a group of farmers from Sumilao, Bukidnon, who went to our province to teach women's organizations how to make brooms from tiger grass to be sold as part of their livelihood program. Can you imagine? And to top it all, these visiting farmers were the ones spoken by Maita earlier. The farmers who walked 1,700 kilometers from Mindanao to Manila to claim their land, who were our partners before when they were still fighting to get their land from government. When they arrived, the immediate impression of the local police was that they might be communist rebels trying to recruit members in one of our towns. But the fact is, these farmers were livelihood trainers, and we had a farmer exchange program that we were implementing in Dinagat. These farmers were livelihood trainers who also happened to be human rights advocates that we trained as paralegals with the alternative law group. If I stood here to enumerate all the other cases like this, it might take the time of the entire conference because unfortunately, there are so many. And that's just here in the Philippines. I agree, but that a lot of these are not documented because there's also a problem in the documentation of the Commission on Human Rights. Just very recently, we were talking to the regional office of the CHR, and they now are required to do a different type of classifying cases that come to them. So not all of the cases that are filed against their office are documented as part of human rights complaints. And that's just here in the Philippines. We know that all these cases of human rights violations against those that defend human rights are all happening at the same time across the world. Now the questions are, what do we do? Where do we start? We do everything we can and we start in everywhere we should. As many of us are here in this conference for human rights, there are also more of us out there in the field, in the trenches. And we need to create stronger networks and linkages among human rights defenders. We defend human rights together, and we also defend ourselves together. We need to protect the media and fight against disinformation. We have to look at journalists as our fellow human rights defenders. They will help in amplifying our voices as we seek to drown out the disinformation that is being continuously and systematically fed to the public. We need to work with government to push for policies that will uplift our cause for human rights and at the same time provide a legal framework that will defend the defenders. And one of such policies is the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act that is being championed by a former colleague in the House, Albay Representative Edsel Lagman. The bill seeks to protect human rights defenders and their right to promote and protect fundamental freedoms, the right to associate and organize, the right to peaceful assembly, privacy, effective remedy, and full reparation, the freedom from intimidation and reprisal, and several others. It also outlines the obligation of the state and public authorities in the protection of and collaboration with human rights defenders. The measure also has a penal provision, which means it will have enough teeth once enacted. The Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill has been approved twice already in the House, in the 17th Congress when I was still Congresswoman, and in the 18th Congress. Unfortunately, it was not enacted due to being shelved in the Senate. This legislative measure has also received the endorsement of the members of the European Parliament and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the protection of human rights defenders. Basically, the proposed law seeks to protect human rights defenders by creating a framework within government to ensure that state actors will value us as partners in development as we work together with respect and trust in upholding human rights that will in effect create a culture in our communities where civil liberties and fundamental freedoms are given premium, ultimately leading to inclusive development. Hopefully, this conference will not only be a vehicle to support this proposed legislative policy, but also give rise to other measures to defend the defenders as well. Another issue I would like to raise is how we promote human rights at the grassroots level. In my experience as an alternative lawyer for the marginalized, a community organizer, and also as a former elected official and governor in the small island province, I learned how to infuse human rights in working with and for different sectors without necessarily using the words human rights. It is unfortunate that the past administration has given human rights a negative connotation. You know, when you start talking about and using the word human rights in villages and communities, especially in the islands, people will leave and hide. And they don't want to be associated with you because they will say you are an NPA. It has vilified and demonized as part of the well-oiled disinformation machinery that is carried over in the new administration. So in the Nagat Islands, I realized that explaining human rights and related concepts was incredibly challenging. Most Dinagatnon are struggling with basic needs such as water, electricity, food, decent jobs, and opportunities to escape poverty. How can I talk about human rights to a family that gathers salty rocks from the sea to be boiled in water as a substitute for soup? How can I explain the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to citizens of the 11th poorest province in the Philippines, where local government officials share the last name? Most of the elected was one of the biggest political dynasty in the country. I realized that simply advocating for human rights wasn't enough to tackle the issues of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. I had to start by addressing their immediate needs and showing them the meaning of development. I had to make them understand that they too had to be part of the solution and that people's participation is crucial, not only for tangible development, but also for fostering understanding and appreciation of human rights. How can I preach about human rights and dignity to people who have been denied those rights by traditional dynastic politics? My people have long been enslaved, both literally and figuratively, and to the point where they have forgotten their own power to bring about change. That's why giving money during elections is very easy. That's why I centered my campaign and work as a public official on reminding people that they still have the power to create the change they need. I learned this not from abstract ideas, but from my experience with the people themselves. As governor of the Nagat Islands, we focused on people's participation in government. And when I say people's participation, not just inviting farmers and fisher folks to attend in seminars and sign attendance sheet and be given AM and PM snacks. And our people are actively involved in protecting our watersheds, meaning they themselves are part of the plan, the decision making, and even in the implementation. So when they are involved in protecting our watersheds, earning a fair living from our seas and our lands, and engaging in governance, the words human rights will become part of their everyday language as they will have experienced what a decent life looks like. And during my time as Congresswoman, we connected all 7 towns with a road network, 110 kilometers, something I couldn't even imagine when I was growing up in the island. Now, every Dinagatnon has the opportunity and mobility to see not only the beauty of our province, but also the inequalities. They can now compare what different governments are doing and demand better for their own communities. I used to see infrastructure projects as tools of traditional politicians. But now, I found ways to turn them into tools for teaching and learning. For example, covered courts, which used to be seen as a typical project of traditional politicians, now also served as evacuation center during disasters, especially when we were the one at the center of Typhoon Odette that destroyed most of our infrastructure projects. When covered courts have the additional purpose, it forces the government to provide disaster risk reduction and management education to the people. Because now the people understand what is required from the municipal governments. I'm not saying that human rights defenders should enter politics and build infrastructure projects. My point is simple. In everything around us, there are opportunities to integrate human rights into every conversation and decision-making processes. It doesn't have to be too academic or doesn't have to be in a language that will not be understood. And we don't even have to take so much effort to translate technical concepts into simple words. We just have to talk, plan, and implement projects that will make sure that people are part of it. In the university, universities must also serve as safe haven for the youth. An important role of universities is political education formation. Universities such as Ateneo should document what NGOs are doing and to popularize it and integrate them even in the curriculum. And I hope that universities and CSOs should work together to facilitate resource sharing and information dissemination. I am sure that there are a lot of success stories for human rights defenders and in defending human rights everywhere in the world. But sometimes we don't talk about it. And that's the problem. If we keep if we keep talking about it, I'm sure that people will also make sure that their work on human rights continues. However, spreading the message of human rights will always be challenging to people who have never felt heard or given a voice. But as advocates, when we find ways to show them that they can participate, we are slowly lifting the blinders placed over their eyes by those who have abused their rights. We defend human rights, we defend those who do not enjoy human rights, and we defend those who defend human rights. All of these are daunting tasks, but as Kapepe Jokno said, they are all worthy. And as we gather in this important week-long event, let us reaffirm our unwavering dedication to the cause of human rights. Let us share our experiences, insights, and strategies in advancing human rights in the Philippines and beyond. And let us strengthen our capacities as human rights defenders and support each other in our common pursuit for justice, equality, and dignity for all. Maayong buntag sa tanan. Daghang salamat.
Thank you very much, Kaka. Next, for our penultimate talk this morning, we have Marie-Luz Paris of the University College Dublin. Marie-Luz is Associate Professor in Law at UCD, Sutherland School of Law. She is the Academic Director of the UCD Center for Human Rights, and she has held research visiting positions at the University of California, Davis, and at the Australian National University Center for European Studies. She holds international recognition and is awarded the Chevalier rank. I will not even attempt to pronounce the French, but this is the oldest, most prestigious non-military decoration awarded to civilians in France. Marie-Luz received her legal education at the University of Paris II, Panthéon-Assas, France's first law university, and she also holds 2 masters from the same institution. She received the title of Doctor en Droit for her PhD on the implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights by the United Kingdom. And she joined UCD Sutherland School of Law to teach in the BCL law with French law and dual degree programs, which aim at training UCD law students to the French civil law system. Marie-Luz also teaches on a number of undergraduate and graduate courses, which include comparative constitutional law as well as ECHR law. So everyone, please welcome Marie-Luz of UCD.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me today to speak to such a prestigious audience. Can you hear me well? Or, yeah, because I can't hear. So I would like to thank the organizers, Ateneo School of Law, and especially the Dean and the Associate Dean, Professors Ophilenia and Professor Chan Gonzaga. I would like also to thank the organizers and coordinators of the CALESA project who gave me the opportunity to take part in the project. So my presentation today is about freedom of speech, which is a field of study in itself. It's very wide, and even from a European perspective. So I've decided to give you a bit of background about freedom of speech, how we approach it in the European context, what I call the basics about freedom of expression. I don't want to lecture though, so it's not a lecture. And then I will talk about hate speech, which I was given this topic, specific topic within freedom of expression. Yeah, so trying to see how from a European perspective we have tried to maintain a healthy freedom of expression because with certain limitations. In a context in Europe, I think with an increasing hatred among people and different new technological means, including obviously social media and artificial intelligence. So that's the context. So maybe, yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the outline. So it's a very broad, and at the end of the presentation, you will have very general ideas about this topic, about the significance of freedom of expression in the European context, about the legal framework. I won't go into the details of that, and the tools and methods, and about the trends in hate speech cases. And I will mention 3 cases about hate speech, that's all. And then I will conclude. I know that it's a very sensitive topic in the Philippines, and I like the presentation before, all the presentations before mine. And I know that this topic was discussed in the framework in 2019, I think, in the framework of the ASEAN conference or consultation on freedom of opinion and expression, which took place in Indonesia in 2019. And I understand that several inputs were made or recommendations were made. So this is a topic which is relevant everywhere. So to start with a few basics about freedom of expression. So it's the most universally recognized human right. Next slide, please. Historically and geographically. So you have all these what we call the modern Declaration of Rights, and geographically all the constitutions of the world have a provision about freedom of expression. We mentioned the Constitution of the Philippines just before. Obviously, in those provisions, you have the freedom of expression, or you have freedom of expression and freedom of the press or the media. In older constitutions, that's not the case, because obviously that was not as prevalent. So there is a justification of why freedom of expression is good, and that has to be told, because it's intuitive, but you have to explain why it's good for the individual and for society. So there is an intrinsic justification of freedom expression. It's good for you, it's good for the personal development of the person, and it's good for society. And this is where we connect to the democratic system of government, to the fact that you are looking for the truth, you're looking for what's happening on the ground, etc. So this is why I like this quote, which is actually not in European context. It's the Canadian Supreme Court, which really summarizes all the different justification or explanations of why freedom of expression is good per se and is good as externally. So seeking and attaining the truth is an inherently good activity. Secondly, participation in social and political decision making is to be fostered and encouraged. And thirdly, the diversity in forms of individual self-fulfillment and human flourishing are to be cultivated in an essentially tolerant, indeed welcoming environment, not only for the sake of those who convey the meaning, but also for the sake of those to whom it's conveyed. And this is the right to be informed that was mentioned earlier as well. So there is definitely a constitutional underpinning to freedom of expression. So this is the most sacred human right. Now, in the context of, in the European context, is very much linked to democracy, and there is, when I will mention the case law of the European Court, there is this connection which is made between democracy and freedom of expression. That's, this freedom is the cornerstone of the democratic order. Next And you can find as well this in some constitutional systems where, you know, case law recognizes, I put a Spanish case because that's apparently a very famous case where they, you know, they establish this connection between freedom of expression and how it's connected to democracy. So there is also another way to approach freedom of expression. This is the active and the passive way. So this is important to understand that because it relates to several sub-freedoms, if you want, sub-rights. So obviously there is the active facet, which is the right to inform, to provide information, and this is the case for the media, but not only. And the passive facet of freedom of expression, which is the right to be informed. And for example, in the EU context, so the 27 countries, it's a right to access documents from the administration. So, you know, you can, you know, have sub-rights or, you know, specific rights which are derived from this freedom of expression. Also, the fact to have a pluralist TV or neutral TV, which usually it's said to be the most important media of communication, but I think internet now is the most important one. And of course, but that's, you know, obvious, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. So it is, you know, a right with limitations. And one of the subjects, exam topic I give to my students is really they discuss the limitations of freedom of expression. So you study more the limitations than actually the freedom itself. Now, in terms of legal framework, and this is where I won't give details because I think it's quite technical at this stage, and that's not the topic. Yeah, next slide. So this is a very broad overview, and I don't know, if you are familiar with this, but just obviously when you're a lawyer, practicing lawyer, an academic in Europe, you have to think with a pluralist mind, okay? So you have different legal orders, you have yours. So I told you that each constitution has a provision and the related case law. So you can see the picture is the Declaration of Human Rights, of the Fundamental Rights of the Rights of Man and Citizens, sorry, of 1789, the French one. Sorry, yes, I must say that originally I'm French, but living in Ireland, so I know the Irish system and the French system. And then there are the two European legal systems. And in the EU system, there is a charter, the Charter on Fundamental Rights, which contains a provision on freedom of expression, Article 11. And there is another instrument, which is older, actually, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a legal system of 47 countries, okay? So there are two different systems, and obviously they don't come into play in the same way. So this is where I say I'm not going into the details. But if it's relevant to your case of freedom of expression, you might use, these legal systems and the court. So one is based in Luxembourg and the other, the one in Strasbourg. So I'm going to focus on the ECHR law, the European Convention on Human Rights, because this is the system which is the most maybe interesting in terms of freedom of expression, and it has given guidelines to the other system, okay, in terms of cases, etc. So just, to mention a few, the European system, the convention, sorry. So next slide, please. A few things, so that's a provision, Article 10, and the first paragraph, generally, there are a few substantive rights in this, in the convention like that. So the first paragraph is a principle with a few legitimate aims, if you want to justify the restriction to the freedom of expression. And the second are the restrictions. Okay, so this right exists, but it can be restricted. Now, there are a few other things which are interesting in terms of freedom of expression, and that was mentioned before as well. The state has obviously to refrain from restricting your freedom of expression, but has to do something positive, something concrete to, protect your freedom of expression. That's what we call the positive obligations. And there is a test. And this is what, again, we have either to talk about the ground, protecting fundamental rights, or if we are academics, we have to talk about techniques. We can't talk about general ideas. So the aim for lawyers, I think, is to know what the legal standards are, to be very familiar with the case law of these two European systems. And this is what I mean when I talk about legal standards. There has been a test which has been developed by the European Court of Human Rights, which is very useful to you as a citizen or as your counsel to go to court and to see if your case, it's not a story of winning the case, but it's if your case is a valid case to sanction your state, which has violated your freedom of expression. And this test is a 3-stage test. Again, okay, it's not on the slide because I don't want to go into this level of details, but the law that restricts your freedom of expression has to be prescribed, so in the books. It's either a statute law or common law. It applies to both forms of law. And then it has to be legitimately justified, so it has to address a legitimate aim, which are on this second paragraph. So, for example, protecting the rights of others. You can't say whatever you want because you protect the right of others. You protect also the authority of the judiciary, authority and impartiality of the judiciary, or protecting public order if there is a threat to democratic order. And then the last part of the test is the most problematic one, because in addition to all that, to do your checklist, you have to know if this restriction put by the state authorities on freedom of expression can be justified in terms of pressing social need, if it's a necessary thing to do in a democratic society. For example, prohibiting the publication of a book, or granting an injunction to stop, for example, a conference. Okay, so can this be justified under certain circumstances? And so you have the test. That's helpful. And that's how we deal with freedom of expression as lawyers. But then this is not an answer. The answer will be different according to each case. So the difficulty is that with this, okay, you have some guidance, but at the same time, you don't know if you will win the case or not. And it's not a question of winning, but it's a question of recognizing a violation or not. So you can predict a bit what the outcome will be, but you have to be very aware of the case law, the previous case law of the Court of Human Rights. Okay, so that's the technique of it, how we approach that from a European perspective, and certainly when you will practice not only your constitutional law system, but when, for example, after having exhausted all your remedies at national level, you go to Strasbourg, to the European Court, and you say, okay, I'm not happy with the case that was given by my national system, and I want to go to the higher level, which is the Strasbourg level, and you have a freedom of expression case. And this is at this stage that this all applies. Now, I'm not talking about other things about the margin of appreciation, but let's come back to this notion of hate speech. So hate speech is a form of expression which is very problematic, and the fact is that there is no universal definition of hate speech in international human rights law or European human rights law. You have obviously attempts to again guide the lawyers into what hate speech is. So I've put two examples there, not two examples, but two documents. So the one by the UN and one recommendation by the Council of Europe. For the UN, hate speech is any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. So you always have this kind of enumeration of grounds generally in those provisions. And then the other, maybe it's a different angle, but the other from the Council of Europe it is to be understood as covering all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, which is very important in the European context, or other forms of hatred based on intolerance. And that refers to the values of the system. And then, the case law, the cases about freedom of expression in Europe are like, there are thousands of them for the European Court. So there are very many. So I can't study all of them. Next slide, please. So the court has recognized, it reveals a variety of values which have been considered in this context to be contrary to the constitutional paradigm of the ECHR, of freedom of expression. And you have all the isms. You have the Nazism, fascism, racism, anti-Semitism, and fundamentalist Islamic fundamentalism. All these forms of speech can, I'm not saying, well, if they are recognized as such, they can fall under, a violation of the provision of freedom of expression. Okay. Now it depends again on the case, and the difficulty is obviously to draw the line. So it's a question of, a very fine line between what offense, merely offense, because an important aspect as well, and it's linked to democracy actually, the convention allows expression which offends, disturbs, and shocks. And this relates to the fact that we are allowed to speak what we think, okay? But, there is a fine line when it's recognized as, when the speech in question or the expression in question is so full with hatred that there is an incitement to violence and to actions that, are dangerous. So, and then again, this is a technique, but this is what has been used by the court. It has used two provisions, so the Article 10 I was mentioning, but also the Article 17, which is about the abuse of rights. It means that, in other words, if your speech, if your expression is so full of hatred, it cannot be covered by your freedom of expression. You cannot invoke, cannot say, oh, I really, it's my expression, my conviction, when in fact it's really disturbing. So this is what we call the approach of exclusion, okay, based on this. And if you negate the values of the convention, so there is always the question about what are these values of the convention. So you will find in the case law these words and these expressions which are used, and they are these ones: tolerance, pluralism, social peace, and non-discrimination. So this is what we see in most of the cases. And now you have the approach of setting restrictions. And this is what I was talking about, this paragraph 2, where to draw the line. And again, it's on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so the hate speech is not apt to destroy the values of the convention, but it's still problematic. So what you will have under this paragraph, this provision of Article 10, paragraph 2, you will have violation of Article 10, meaning that the individual citizen will be vindicated because his right will be violated by the state, or non-violation. In other words, the state was justified in restricting your freedom of expression, okay? So the thing is that there is no police for the European Convention. So if the state in question doesn't want to respect, the ruling of the court, it's possible. Unfortunately, most of the countries, obviously, they sign the treaty, they respect, the cases, but as well that some countries are more problematic than others. Russia, for example, which now has left the system, but was very problematic in abiding with the rulings of the convention. The UK, as well, has always wanted to get out, and they don't really respect, some of the decisions, etc. But now, so there is this dividing line, and I will give you a few examples. Now, this is not a very nice slide, I think, but I didn't know how to do it. So the first approach I was mentioning, and there is a list here of different types of different things which are problematic, such as threat to democratic order, racial hate, negationism and revisionism. When I told about anti-Semitism, it's, you know, when there is a speech related to that, religious hate, ethnic hate, incitement to violence and to support terrorist activity. And in fact, this is from the website of the Convention on Human Rights is very good, and they have fact sheets about, you know, different topics, and this is the one from hate speech. So if you want to have a look at that and see how they approach things, you can look at this fact sheet and this one in particular. So it's just a list of the different categories of hate speech that the court has encountered. So the first case is Belkacem against Belgium. So I give you the problematic hate speech and then give you a bit of the facts and the ruling of the court. So in that case, Belkacem, he was making YouTube videos about, and he called on the viewers on these videos to overpower non-Muslim people and to teach them a lesson and to fight them. So these were the expressions which were used in the videos. So the fact is that he was convicted. He was convicted in Belgium by the authorities for discrimination and hatred and violence on the account of these videos. And he said that his argument, he said that he was trying to, you know, express his convictions, his beliefs, and that was covered by his freedom of expression. But the court, the Strasbourg court, the highest level, they went all the way to the highest court in Belgium, and then he made a complaint to the Strasbourg court, and they declared his application inadmissible on the ground of Article 17. Okay, so in other words, he was not, you know, he couldn't go anywhere with that, because the content of the videos available had a markedly hateful content, and that the applicants sought to stir up hatred, discrimination and violence toward all non-Muslims. So it was contrary to the values of the convention, and that was the case. And you will see another case that I will mention about Article 10, which is the other situation. So that's an example. And then in other cases, and I will mention the one Jersild and Delphi, but the Ferret against Belgium case, for example, is the opposite. It's a member of the Nationalist Front, Ferret, was a member of the parliament who expressed hatred against Muslims people, and he was, you know, there was no violation because that was, you know, okay. So when I was, and Zemmour against France. Zemmour is a very famous politician in France. He was running for the presidential election in France, and he expressed again the same views. And this is why at the beginning I was saying that in Europe there is a really charged context with hatred. Now I would like to insist on the Jersild and Delphi. Jersild, it's an old case, 1994, but it's a very representative case about how you can make distinctions between a speech which is offensive and another which is not, and especially when there is a public interest. So, Jersild against Denmark, the hate speech in question was about abusive and derogatory remarks which were made about immigrants in Denmark, and against certain ethnic groups. It was made on TV. At the time there was no internet or social media. The fact is that these remarks were made in the context of a documentary, and the documentary was made by a journalist, Jersild. The thing is that the journalist was convicted of, you know, he was convicted of aiding and abetting the dissemination of racist remarks, just because he interviewed this group of young people who made the racist comments, but not him. He wanted just to show through the documentary about the situation in Denmark at the time, and he wanted to show what was the this social situation about young people not respecting people from other origin, but he was the one who was convicted. So obviously he said, that's against my freedom of expression. I'm a journalist, I've made a documentary. And the court here, interestingly, made the distinction, okay? So it was a violation of Article 10, okay? So the state was not justified in restricting the freedom of expression. So because the behavior of the journalists could not be qualified as aimed at propagating racist views, it was about making these issues, social issues, known to the public. There was a public interest in that, people could hear about these very bad views about the young people. I mean, they were a group of young people. So the court made the distinction. Now, the last case is about, well, I pass on the other ones, but the case about Delphi, it's about online hate speech, which is now a prevalent thing, and you will have more and more cases about online, or the different comments that you can post online, and how to actually regulate online hate speech. Now, just a little digression from that. There is, in the EU context, not in the European Convention, but in the EU context, the approach of the EU is to legislate, to find a legislation that could regulate hate speech online. The UK, for example, is looking to legislate as well. There is a bill at the moment in the UK which is examining, and the EU is looking for a common regulatory framework. Obviously, the Strasbourg, in the framework of the convention, it's not possible. It's not the job of the convention of the court to regulate, but it can, address the problems in the cases. So what was it about? It was about, there was a company, a ferry company, Delphi, and it had a news portal where people could post comments about the company, and this news portal was owned by another company. It was a different company than the ferry, the transport company. But on this news portal, you had the news, okay, and underneath, as you know, you had the comments from the readers. And some comments from the readers were, full of hatred. They were anti-Semitic comments, etc. So the problem was that the owner of the news portal was convicted again because he allowed, or they allowed, these comments to be made, and they were told by the Estonian authorities to withdraw the comments, to stop the comments and to erase that. They didn't do it for the first 6 weeks. They just did it after 6 weeks. And in that case, there was no violation of Article 10. Because the court found that the Estonian courts finding, when they found the company liable, they had been justified, and the restriction to their freedom of expression, the fact to have a news portal, was justified, proportionate, on to the freedom of expression, because given the extreme nature of the comments which were done on the portal. So that was a known violation, okay? But again, if you can imagine that if the company had withdrawn the comments a bit before, that could have been a violation of their freedom of expression, a case of violation. So this is very subtle, very on a case-by-case basis. So, but this is how Europe, the convention system approaches, cases of hate online, which is not, something easy to do, because you are looking for consistency. You are looking to have a consistent case law. And again, an exam question that I'm asking the students is, do you think the case law of the court is consistent? There is a kind of coherence. And obviously they don't have to read all the cases, but it's difficult to say, because sometimes it's very political. It's, it's not, especially when, you have the religious aspect, or, the cultural aspect involved. So that's a very difficult, and sometimes the court finds itself in very difficult position to justify some, violation or, non-violation. Now, I would like to conclude by giving you some trends and final remarks, and then as well as references. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, generally speaking, we seem to have some consistency in the case law of the court, because it has regularly emphasized the vital role that freedom of expression plays in the system in the different European states, and especially freedom of the media, of journalists. That's very important in the case law of the court. And in terms of the predictability of the case law, it's not very satisfactory. There are numerous factors involved in free speech or free expression cases, such as the nature, the form of expression, the media used, the context in which it's used, the social attitudes, the technological developments. This is why it's very important to follow this area, to anticipate a bit what the trends could be in freedom of expression. So I've put a few questions there, and especially the importance of the right to access to documents. Okay, so this is a right which is recognized in under EU law, but it's not recognized as such under the convention. There is no provision in that. The problem with public figures, how they are protected in their freedom of speech, the problem of the concept of public interest. Is the freedom of expression worth it to be protected? Because it, draws your attention to a problem of public interest. And again, this hate speech and incitement to violence in the dimension of a secular Europe. So that's a quote I took from a book, a textbook. The author is talking about a more secular Europe. Personally, I believe no, it's not becoming more secular. It's become more diverse and religiously diverse in Europe. So that's the problem, to reconcile, all these aspects. This is what I think. So that's all for me, and thank you very much. And I've put in this last slide, please, some references, which, yeah, so thanks very much again.
Thank you, Mariluz. For our last talk this morning, we have a friend and colleague from the University of Malaga. Pablo began his research career in the field of constitutional law, defending in 2012 a thesis entitled Europe and the Constitution, the European Idea in the Constituent Courts of 1978 and in the Constitutional Reforms of 1992 and 2011. In 2013, he obtained a master's degree in constitutional law from the Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales. And in 2014, he was awarded a scholarship from Obra Social for doctoral studies in Spanish universities. For a period of 4 years, he was hired by the University of Seville, and within the framework of the doctoral program in law, he completed a doctoral thesis entitled Greater Protection as a Rationalizing Criterion of the Fragmentation of Human Rights in Global Constitutionalism. He has carried out research stays in the School of Law of the University of Berkeley and the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. He is also currently a professor of constitutional law at the University of Malaga and is researching the regulation of artificial intelligence. So, ladies and gentlemen, Pablo Sanchez Molina.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here today with all of you. Thank you, Ateneo de Manila, especially to Jose Maria Ofileña and Maita Chan Gonzaga, and of course the director of CALESA project. Jose Torres Perea. I'm the last one, and we are running out of time, so I will try to be brief. Let's go. Okay, no? In an advertisement campaign, about the Spanish national soccer team in the Qatar World Cup, the speech of the advertisement itself was created by an artificial intelligence based on 842,460 people. Real opinions about the national soccer team. The artificial intelligence has been able to represent in a rigorous and scientific way what more than 47 million people feel about the national team, generating an emotional speech. This ad, which had been seen by thousands of people in Spain, and is further a proof that this is increasingly present in our daily lives. And ChatGPT and others are only the top of the iceberg. In my speech, I would like to focus on the challenge of constitutional law and human rights in the advance of artificial intelligence. This is a new matter and it's difficult to provide some conclusions. But on the contrary, I will raise several questions. Sorry for this. This is not universally accepted concept of artificial intelligence being the subject of multiple definitions, but there is quite a consensus that it's based on making the machine behave like a human being, as established by the European Economic and Social Committee on Artificial Intelligence. Disadvantages in technology require effective regulation in this respect. Of course, with national rules, but this will have to be inserted in a European legal framework. At this point, the European Union intends to have one of the first regulation to this effect on the basis that being a world power means being a leader in artificial intelligence. I will explain the most important points of the regulation of the European Parliament about artificial intelligence. It's called Artificial Intelligence Law. If we read the whereas at the beginning of the regulation, we can see the objectives of this regulation. The objective is to improve the functioning of the internal market by establishing a uniform legal framework in accordance with European Union values, such as ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, and human rights. Of course, artificial intelligence may generate risks and undermine public interest and rights protected by union law. Apart, of course, from the many beneficial uses of artificial intelligence, such technology can also be misused and provided powerful new tools for manipulative, exploitative, and socially controlling practices. Of course, this should be prohibited in order to respect the human dignity, freedom, equality, democracy, and of course, the rule of law. The proposed regulation explicitly identifies 4 levels of risk. This is the most important. The regulation identifies 4 levels of risk. The top level comprises uses that present an unacceptable risk to the safety, livelihoods, and rights of the individuals. These use cases are prohibited in the Article 5 of the regulation, of the proposal of regulation. Unless these cases are authorized by law for national security purpose and including social scoring, AE system, manipulating of human behavior that cause harm and mass surveillance. The second tier, including high right use, will undergo a conformity assessment before they can be developed in the market. The conformity assessment examines the quality of data sets to minimize risk and discrimination outcomes. Documentation and record keeping for traceability, transparency, and information provided to users. Human oversight, robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity provisions. The European Union law defines a list of artificial intelligence use that will be considered high risk, such access to employment, education, and public service, critical infrastructure management, vehicle safety components, law enforcement, and administration of justice, between others. The third level is composed of limited risk use and will only have transparency obligations. And the last and the fourth level, including minimal risk uses that will not be subject to any obligations. Although voluntary codes of conduct are recommended. These codes of conduct could increase, of course, confidence on this type of system of artificial intelligence adoption and provide a lever for server differentiation and thus a competitive advantage in accordance with EU values. I would like to talk about, in the next presentation, I would like to talk about the challenge for human rights and, of course, constitutional law with this type of technologies. We can find a very interesting report on artificial intelligence in a digital age that talk about the transparency of algorithms. We can see now with Twitter, for example, talk about the effective mechanisms to fight against discrimination, that we are going to talk about this type of topic in the next days. And bias. Talk about the use by the police, by police and judicial authority of this type of technology, and of course, this try to contribute to the promotion of political and social pluralism by facilitating participation in electoral process, virtual campaigns, and online activism, as well as a dialogue and debate between citizens and their representatives and governments. This report was created by a European Union Special Commission on artificial intelligence in the digital age, as I told you, as I told you before. For the future of the democracy, this type of technology can help to improve, to try to improve, to help to build a more transparent and efficient public sector, for example. Of course, this technology, the problem, as I told you before, is that have ethical and legal question. This technology, the artificial intelligence technology, in fact, is the automation of information processing on an unprecedented scale, paving the way on collective surveillance, and of course is a threat to fundamental rights, especially the right of privacy and data protection. The risk of this technology is that it's possible to gain more information about a person's identity and behavior, and knowledge about the decision history, considering that this profiling pose risk to democratic system and imbalance of powers. Finally, before getting into the uses that I think that are interesting to discuss, of course there are benefits and opportunities for society with the adoption of this type of technologies, but this will be in accordance with fundamental rights, values, and of course legislation. For the debate, I would like to talk about these three topics. I would like to ask you about this topic. The first of them is my opinion. Legal regulation about artificial intelligence is urgently needed, but it's very difficult because the advance of this type of technologies. So I think that now, of course, we don't have the legal framework to regulate in a good sense, in a good way, this type of technology. And this, of course, is a risk. And the evolution of this technology in the last month was amazing. So we have to take care about that. And we have to try to be working about a new regulation, I think in the next months. We cannot wait for that. I thinking about two more things, and I'm not sure about the answer of these things. The first of these two things is that, of course, the current fundamental rights are adequate to protect citizens or not. We have to implement new fundamental rights, or with the fundamental rights that we have recognized in our legal system is enough. So these two questions, I think I don't have an answer. I'm between both. So maybe if some of you knows about this type of topic and would like to debate with me after this speech, I will appreciate that. So that's all. Thank you so much, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Pablo, perhaps we can invite you to sit up front in case there are questions. At this point, we do have a bit of time for to conduct an open forum of sorts. Any question or intervention that that anyone may wish to share or ask, perhaps we can just provide the basic what do you call this, flow, no? If you have something to add to the discussion or to ask any of our speakers, please come to the microphone. There's one in the middle of the room. Perhaps we can also offer the other microphone. Just state your name and affiliation. Please identify the speaker or speakers you wish to ask the question of, and my personal request so that other interventions may be heard, be concise and direct to the point. Okay? So, who will break the ice? All right. Attorney Jimenez Damari.
Good morning all. My name is Attorney Sed Jimenez. Salamat Maita for recognizing me. Actually, it's really a question. I'm very, very curious because I was listening to the presentation of Pablo. Pablo, you're on the dock. And my question, because I'm also specializing in international humanitarian law, where there are a lot of problems on artificial intelligence, particularly for example, the use of drones. So I was just wondering, of course, what you gave us was really more on the human rights perspective, including freedom of speech, etc. But I was wondering, where do you see the intersection between the human rights and IHL on the use of artificial intelligence, and what are the issues that we should look out for? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. If I have understand in a good way, you asked me about the connection between artificial intelligence and human rights. Uh-huh. Okay, it's difficult to say to give you a good answer about this because the main debate about artificial intelligence right now, of course, are about privacy, are about I think democracy, because you can control the people and you can control how the people behave, because you have an incredible use of data. This is the way that they are researching right now. Your question is very good, but I don't know. I have to research about that. Of course, if you are coming next days to the to the presentation, to the lectures. I would like to share, I want to focus about your question, and I can answer in private if you want tomorrow, if you're coming. Okay? So sorry for that. I would like to be honest.
All right. Anything related to the question from the two gentlemen who raised their hands before we move on? All right. Attorney Garcia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Angelo Garcia from the Ateneo de Manila College of Law. This question is addressed to Professor Pablo. Basically, the question is with regards to how do we move forward with the modeling, or have there been any attempts at the modeling of AI models in relation to a person's right to due process, for example? Because right now there seems to be a move towards associating AI technology with due process, in the sense that as AI becomes more complex and accurate, it almost seems as if the decision made by the AI becomes the basis of certain actions of governments, for example, or even in small frame, like looking at it at a smaller level, like for example, when educators use softwares to determine whether or not a paper is plagiarized or used with the aid of AI technology, for example. So in light with that, how do AIs, or how do we move forward
Hello.
with
Sorry.
yes.
Do you mind speaking louder and slower?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Thank you.
So in relation to that, when these AIs, for example, are used as a form of decision-making tools, to what extent is there a need, for example, for the AI or the person using the AI to divulge the metrics that the artificial intelligence uses to come up with these decisions? And is there a need for this kind of model to be implemented in all types of artificial intelligence, not necessarily just for those that are used in decision-making process, or just for the usual algorithms such as sorting or organization of data? Thank you.
Okay. Sí. Que no escuché. Sí, sí, sí. Vale. Sí. Sí. Ah. Vale, vale, vale. Claro, claro.
Did you have something to add,
Vale, vale.
Angela?
Muchas gracias. ¿Eres mi traductor oficial? Gracias. Okay, I have understand. Perfect now, right now. I'm agree with you. I think we have to go further and implement a new algorithm. I don't know how to pronounce very well. To avoid this type of course, discrimination, because sometimes this type of intelligence, they are learning, and all of us, they learn with some bias. So I think we can implement, and the first measure for that is try to open the whole algorithm in order that everybody can check and can implement like a open database, and you can go and you can implement and you can know where this algorithm is working well or working not well. So I agree with you. I think it's very important. I think this will be a revolution in the next years, of course, and we're not prepared. It's like the pandemic. I think it's a revolution. It's something new, and we don't have the legal system to protect us in order to use this type of new technology. But I totally agree with you. We have to try to do better algorithm in order to avoid this bias or this gender, disabilities, or something like that. Okay. Thank you so much for your question.
All right, thank you. Emilio, did you have something to add? Go ahead.
I just would like to thanks all the presenters or all the persons that have make a presentation today. I just want to add something that in order the issue that you, dear colleague, arises concerning the presentation of our colleague Pablo. I work in the field of criminal law, and for me it's quite interesting to study the link between using artificial intelligence, especially in some stage of the criminal process. In Spain, I think that also in all Latin America, in Europe, and in the United States as well, I think that here is the same. Oh, I'm sorry, here is the same as well. The attribution of criminal liability sometimes is developed taking into account the dangerousness of one person. And at least in the US, they have been studying, and also they have applied one algorithm in order to try to determine which kind of dangerousness has some specific criminal offender. And for me, I think that, and this is linked with fundamental rights. For me, it's quite dangerous to go until the point to state that one person has her or his future previously described. One algorithm says that somebody is going to commit a crime. We can deny the free will. We are in the position to deny the free will. This is a discussion that comes from very old times. I think that it begins with Greeks or something like that. But this is what we are studying right now. This is one problem that we have to face, and this is linked especially with one basic principle of fundamental rights: the human dignity. We don't have free will. or we have it, no? And I think that at the present, judges, courts are not necessarily using, or they don't need to use artificial intelligence to arrive to these conclusions. They are doing right now using traditional methods. Traditional methods, maybe intuition, or maybe a report from a psychologist or some social worker, but we are doing that. And I think that artificial intelligence faces in this same problem, and we are dealing with this from all times. So I think this is my contribution with your question from the perspective of criminal law. Thank you very much. It wasn't a question, it wasn't just a comment.
Thank you for the intervention. It has like touches of the Minority Report, and things that we used to think were only science fiction, but are becoming more evidently part of our world. What with ChatGPT and similar programs, and precisely artificial intelligence and the IHL issues, not only the human rights issues that it might touch on. When I was listening to Attorney Damari ask her questions, my initial reaction was to look at the thesis committee members on one side of the room and say, this is actually a very, very rich source of material for further research. Artificial intelligence and similar concepts, and how how we can answer some of Pablo's some of Pablo's questions in his last slide, right? Are current fundamental rights actually adequate to protect citizens from the risks of artificial intelligence? Are new rights necessary, etc.? Food for thought. And how does this all play with precisely the concept of human dignity? Any other interventions? Any other questions, whether from participants or the speakers themselves? Yes, go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Attorney Perez of University of Cebu. So I would like to address this question to Ma'am Paulson, since you discussed earlier regarding the different issues and challenges on human rights in the Philippines. So one of the identified areas in human rights in the Philippines, and I think it should be included in the conversation as to how we fulfill and promote rights of persons with diverse or GSC. And in relation to that point, I would like to know your thoughts whether or not the UN observes the continuous exclusion of SOGSE rights in the country, and how should the Philippines move forward. For context, I'm teaching gender sensitivity, children and women's laws in the university. That's why I have to ask the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, from the UN, it's very clear, and especially from the Human Rights Office, but also from everywhere, that SOGI rights are part of human rights, and non-discrimination applies equally to SOGI populations as it would to, you know, other groups that are at risk of marginalization. So there's no issue there. The principle of non-discrimination applies, right? Then in some countries, of course, you come up to certain cultural, perceptions, ideas, which over time perhaps can be reformed and changed, as they have in other fields, right? As has happened with gender, or persons with disabilities. So I think in that sense, it's a gradual process. I mean, what I would say for the Philippines is yes, there is a need for comprehensive non-discrimination legislation, which hasn't been adopted yet. There is a need for awareness raising and public outreach, and indeed the government has a role to play, but civil society has a role to play too. Universities have a role to play too. Schools, I mean, you have had a big debate about school uniforms in private schools here as well, right? So, I mean, and I know you have a whole day talking about this later, so I don't want to preempt anything, but I think for the UN, in many ways, free and equal is our big campaign on it, and it's kind of a not that controversial issue within the international and in the UN human rights framework, but when it comes to national level, it becomes in practice much more difficult, right? And actually business has a big role to play in this too. So all of that. But so yes, thank you for that question, and indeed very important issue for the Philippines, I think.
Thank you, King, and thank you, Sina. Any other questions or interventions from the floor? We're all hungry? Oh, go ahead.
So good afternoon, everyone. This question is directed to Ms. Mariluz on media, on the issue of media.
Sorry, do you mind just providing name and affiliation?
Yes,
so I
my name is Attorney Shane Dinopol. I'm from the University of San Agustin in Iloilo City.
welcome.
Yes. So, ma'am, the question is on lack of accountability in the use of social media by reason of internet anonymity. So there is a lack of accountability because social media users are mostly anonymous, in the context of users in the Philippines. So what is your stand, ma'am, on anonymity in the internet? Should we continually allow internet users to remain anonymous and thus prevent accountability, especially in spread of fake news or, say, for example, disinformation or hate speech in the internet? Or do we require, let's say, social media platforms to require their data to be written or sent online, and thus now an issue of privacy? So, in your opinion, ma'am, what is your stand on internet or social media anonymity in the context of your topic? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for just to like that. Thanks very much for the question. It's an interesting question, very difficult to address because I might have my personal opinion. It's we talked about the chilling effect. If you have, if you give your name, that's the main disadvantage. And I'm always thinking like a lawyer, the pros and cons. So I won't give you an answer to what my in terms of anonymity, and again, it depends on what the framework would be and in which context. So if you talk about the constitutional law, constitutional context, I don't know, what the different systems will favor in terms of anonymity or not. I mentioned that the EU is looking into a regulatory framework about, online hate speech and how to sanction that. And how to take care about this, anonymity or not. So it's always a balance, and what the court has done, it's always a balance between, according too much freedom, so the freedom of anonymity, posting anonymous comments, and then you have free, and just you sanction when the line is, is crossed with the hate speech, or you remove anonymity. And it's now the regulation everywhere, and everybody has to give their names. But what about maybe there will be, the dark web or dark social media, and the problem will be the same because you will have websites and all this which will emerge with anonymity anyway. So I don't know, because we talk about the artificial intelligence, that might be possible to to do that again. So I don't have a really strong stance on anonymity or not. And again, it's a political decision in each system to about what system do you favor. If you are, I think there needs to be more studies in terms of the harm which is caused by all this speech and anonymity. Like, I don't have any knowledge of a study, for example, which is linking, the fact that all these comments on social media are anonymous, and what the potential harming it can do to others, to etc. So I think it's a study, it's a field of study which can be related to a law, a legal study about anonymity. So yeah, that's my position. And I mentioned that there is in the UK, for example, and again I'm talking only about speech. Hate speech online. There is a UK safety bill which is currently before Parliament, I think, but because of the change of government, they haven't adopted it. So I don't think they will remove anonymity. It's not on the card. So it's always regulating hate speech, but it's never too much about anonymity. Well, that's my answer.
Thank you, Mary-Luz. Thank you also, Attorney Dinopol, for the question. Any other questions before we break? Well, in any case, I'm hoping all of you stay for lunch. And at lunch, I hope that this can be, everyone wouldn't mind being interrupted to ask to share more thoughts on any matter. So we'll all have lunch together. Just a few reminders, though, before we end the first set of sessions for the seminar on emerging human rights issues. First, I'd like to beg, really, guys, please attend tomorrow. Please come. We hope to see all of you again tomorrow. In the same venue. Secondly, there is an evaluation form which is important for us in the context of the CALESA project. And the link to the form was sent in an email to everyone. I know because I was the one who sent it. But in case you missed that email, just let me know. I'll resend the link. But in any case, also the link for the evaluation is in the paper, the program that would have been distributed to you at registration. So it's also there. That's the second reminder. I only have 5. The third one is that we are putting together a Google folder with all the presentations, the PowerPoint presentations, as well as the talks as delivered. We're compiling it into one drive, one folder. I don't know what it's really called, but we will share that with you as well by the end of the conference. All right. Next, lunch is at the cafeteria, and it is on the ground floor. All right, we're on the 4th floor. So lunch is at the cafeteria on the ground floor. They've made preparations for us. You can either take the stairs, which is right after the elevator, or you can also take the elevator. Again, I apologize for the state of our building. We are undergoing renovations. So lunch at the ground floor cafeteria. And finally, if I may request the usual thing to end, can we have a picture, please? If everyone could sort of gather up here or there, or seated, and then we can just take. What do you think? Okay, seated, and then we'll take from here. Okay, but can those at the side of the room please just occupy the middle seats for the picture? We'll be sure to include this in the folder.